When I walked out of that house on Thanksgiving morning, I wasn't running away from anything. I was walking toward the first honest thing I had done in 40 years. I want you to picture it, because I've pictured it 10,000 times since then, turning it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath. The kitchen smelled like raw poultry and dish soap. The oven was cold. I had never even turned it on. The 22-pound turkey I had defrosted for 3 days in the refrigerator was sitting in the roasting pan exactly where I had placed it the night before. Still pale, still raw, still waiting for someone to care about it. Someone like me. Someone who had always cared about things that no one else bothered to care about. My keys were on the counter by the fruit bowl. Not forgotten. Not accidentally left behind. Placed there with the same deliberate care I had once placed my wedding ring on my finger, believing that gesture meant something permanent. I had my purse. I had my coat. I had a small overnight bag I had packed 4 days earlier and hidden in the trunk of my car, tucked underneath an old quilt my mother had made by hand back in 1968. The one with the blue and yellow hexagons that had always made me think of the sky breaking through after a long winter. I had my dignity, though it had taken me the better part of 4 decades to locate it. What I did not have, for the first time since November 22, 1984, was any intention of serving anyone a single thing. My name is Loretta Mae Hutchins. I am 67 years old. I grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky, which tells you just about everything you need to know about where I learned that a woman's worth is measured in what she gives away. I have 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and until that Thursday morning in November of 2024, I had not taken a single holiday for myself in 40 years of motherhood. I want to tell you that story. Not the polished version. Not the version where I'm a saint and everyone else is a villain. Because the truth is more complicated and more interesting than that. I want to tell you the real version. The one that starts with a young woman who believed love meant sacrifice and ends with an old woman who finally understood the difference between love and disappearance. But before I do, I need to ask something of you, and I'm going to ask it plainly because that's the only way I know how to speak anymore. If this story touches something in you, if you hear yourself in any part of it, please hit that subscribe button and ring that little bell so you never miss another story from this channel. Stories like mine don't get told nearly enough, and the only way they reach the women who need them most is if people like you help carry them forward. Hit that like button too, because it takes 1 second and it means the world to this community we're building together. And please, leave me a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you feel. Tell me what city or country you're watching from right now. There are women all over this world sitting in kitchens just like mine, doing everything for everyone and quietly disappearing. Your comment might be the thing that reminds one of them she's not alone. Now let me tell you how I got to that cold kitchen on Thanksgiving morning. I was born Loretta Mae Combs in the spring of 1957, the third of 5 children in a coal country household that ran on stubbornness, cornbread, and the unspoken understanding that women kept things together while men kept things broken. My father, Gerald Combs, worked the mines from the time he was 17 until a roof collapse in 1971 ended his working life and began a different kind of darkness in our home. He wasn't a cruel man. I want to be fair about that, because fairness matters to me even when it's inconvenient. But he was a broken man after that accident, and broken men have a way of transferring their fractures to the people closest to them without ever meaning to. My mother, Edna Ruth Combs, was the kind of woman who could stretch a pound of ground beef into a meal for 7 people and make everyone feel grateful for it. She was small in stature, barely 5'2", with dark hair that she wore pinned back at the nape of her neck and hands that were always in motion, stirring, folding, patching, cleaning, smoothing. I never once saw my mother sit down in the middle of the day with nothing to do. Looking back on it now, I understand that she didn't sit down because sitting down felt dangerous, like if she stopped moving, something terrible would rush in to fill the space. She had learned somewhere along the way that being useful was the same as being safe. I learned it from her. The way you learn a language when you're very small, not through study, but through complete immersion. By the time I was 10 years old, I was making breakfast for my younger siblings before school. By 12, I was doing the family laundry at the laundromat on Saturdays while my mother worked a cleaning shift at the county hospital. By 14, I could cook a full Sunday dinner and keep the younger ones quiet and keep the house presentable and keep my father's mood from tipping into something frightening, all at the same time. I was 14 years old and I was already a wife in every practical sense of the word, except nobody called it that because there was no ring involved. I was a decent student when I had the time and the energy for school, which was not always. My English teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Albright, who drove in from the next county every day, told me once that I had a sharp mind and that it deserved better than what Harlan County was offering it. I remember standing in the hallway after class, holding my grammar workbook against my chest, feeling something warm flicker inside me at her words, and then walking home to make dinner and watching that flicker go out like a match in the wind. A sharp mind was a luxury. Dinner was a necessity. I graduated high school in 1975. I was 18, and the world felt very large and very full of possibility in that particular way it does, before you've made enough choices to narrow it down. I had a vague idea that I might go to community college in Harlan, or maybe even in Lexington, that I might study something. I wasn't sure what exactly, but something. Something that would use the part of me that Mrs. Albright had seen. Something that would take me somewhere different from the life I had already been practicing for 14 years without my consent. That summer, I met Gerald Hutchins at a 4th of July church picnic. He was 23, broad-shouldered, with dark brown eyes and a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He was from Middlesboro, about 30 miles east of Harlan, and he worked at the Ford dealership there as a mechanic. He had a steady job, a reliable truck, and what I can only describe as a quality of certainty about him, like he knew exactly who he was and where he was going and was simply looking for the right person to go there with him. In hindsight, I understand that what I mistook for certainty was something else entirely. But hindsight is always a clearer lens than the one you're looking through at 22 when a man pays attention to you and makes you feel chosen. Gerald and I dated for a year and were married in the fall of 1976 at the First Baptist Church in Harlan. My mother made my dress from a pattern she found in a McCall's magazine, white eyelet fabric with long sleeves and a row of pearl buttons down the back. My father cried when he walked me down the aisle, which surprised me, because he was not a man who showed emotion easily. It was the only time in my adult life I ever saw him cry. I was 19 years old on my wedding day. The community college idea dissolved quietly, without ceremony, the way small dreams often do. Nobody told me to give it up. Nobody said the words. It just became one of those things that had seemed possible once, before real life moved in and rearranged everything. Gerald and I settled in Middlesboro. He continued at the dealership. I found work at the county courthouse as a filing clerk, which I was good at. I have always been organized, methodical, someone who understands that systems only work when someone maintains them faithfully. We rented a small house on Cumberland Avenue, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with yellow linoleum that was already curling at the corners when we moved in, a backyard with a dogwood tree that bloomed pink every April with a reliability that I found deeply comforting. Our first child, Patricia, we called her Patty, was born in September 1978. She came into the world screaming and red-faced and furious about something, and she has never entirely stopped. I loved her with a force that shocked me, that physical, swallowing love that nobody warns you about before you have a child, the kind that reorganizes your entire interior landscape without asking permission. I left the courthouse job when Patty was 3 months old because daycare in Middlesboro in 1978 cost more than I was making, and Gerald's salary at the dealership covered the mortgage and not much else. The math was simple and devastating. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things that year. Our second child, Dennis, came in 1981. Our third, Carolyn, in 1984. By the time Carolyn arrived, I had been out of the workforce for 6 years. By then, I had stopped thinking of it as temporary and had started thinking of it as simply the shape of my life. Gerald worked. I kept everything else operational. It was division of labor, I told myself. It was what you did. It was what my mother had done, and her mother before her. And it was fine. It was perfectly fine. It was just the way things were for women like us. The first small whisper that something was not quite right came in the winter of 1985. Carolyn was about 8 months old, Dennis was 4, and Patty had just started first grade. It was December, 2 weeks before Christmas, and I was trying to do 17 things simultaneously. Wrap presents, keep Carolyn from pulling the tinsel off the bottom branches of the tree, make sure Dennis didn't eat another crayon, and have dinner ready before Gerald got home from work. Gerald came through the door at 6:15, which was normal. He dropped his keys on the entry table, which was normal. He walked past the living room where I was on my hands and knees retrieving a glass ornament that Carolyn had knocked off the tree. And he went to the refrigerator, got himself a beer, sat down in the recliner, and turned on the television. He did not ask how my day had been. He did not offer to take the baby. He did not look at the half-wrapped presents spread across the living room floor, or the dinner that still needed 30 minutes on the stove, or the fact that I had dark circles under my eyes that had been there without interruption for the past 8 months. I remember kneeling on that living room carpet, holding that glass ornament. It was a red ball with gold glitter that we had bought our first Christmas together, and feeling something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, not yet. More like a door opening onto a room I hadn't known was there, a cold draft coming through, a glimpse of something I wasn't yet ready to name. I put the ornament back on the tree. I went and finished making dinner. I called everyone to the table when it was ready, and I served everyone their plates, and I smiled when Gerald said the pot roast was good. And then I washed the dishes while he watched the evening news, and I got the children bathed and into bed. And by the time I lay down at 10:30, I was so tired I could not have named a single thing I wanted for myself, even if someone had asked. Nobody asked. The years between 1985 and 2000 are something I look back on now with a mixture of tenderness and sorrow. Tenderness because my children were growing, and childhood, even exhausting childhood, is shot through with moments of such pure beauty that they break your heart. Sorrow because I was disappearing inside my own life, and I was doing it so gradually, so quietly, that I didn't even notice until most of me was already gone. Gerald was not. I want to be absolutely clear about this. A man who beat me or threatened me or did any of the things that would have made my situation legible to the outside world. He was what I can only call a man of his time. Someone who had absorbed, without question, the idea that his role was to earn money, and that everything else, the children, the home, the food, the holidays, the emotional labor, the planning, the worrying, the remembering, was simply not his department. He was not cruel about it, he just genuinely did not see it. And I, God help me, I did not make him see it. I kept doing everything, because everything would fall apart if I didn't, and I had 3 children and a mortgage, and nowhere to go, and no income of my own, and no idea that the situation I was in had a name, or that other women were in it too. The children grew. Patty became a teenager who was brilliant at mathematics, and who made me fiercely proud, and who also developed, somewhere around age 15, a quality of certainty about her own rightness that she had inherited from her father in a way that I found deeply uncomfortable to witness. Dennis was quieter, easier, a boy who loved baseball and who spent most of his adolescence in a pleasant fog of sports statistics and school lunch menus. Carolyn was my complicated one, the one who watched everything, who noticed things the other 2 sailed past, who sometimes looked at me across the dinner table with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between concern and pity, which I found unbearable because I refused, absolutely refused, to be pitied by my own child. I found work when Carolyn started kindergarten in 1989, at a dry cleaning business on Main Street, owned by a couple named the Whitfields. I did their books and managed their counter and learned the chemical names for various stains and which solvents worked on silk versus polyester versus wool. It was not glamorous work, but it was mine. My money, my schedule, my small pocket of the day that belonged only to me. I kept that job for 11 years. It gave me something I had lost the name of, some small but essential sense of being a person with a function in the world beyond the domestic. Gerald never exactly objected to my working. He also never once adjusted anything he did to accommodate it. Dinner was still expected at 6:15. The children's school activities were still my domain to manage. The Christmas shopping, the birthday parties, the doctor's appointments, the parent-teacher conferences, the grocery shopping, the bill paying, the holiday planning. All of it remained precisely as it had been, with the single modification that I was now doing it all while also working 25 hours a week. I told myself I was managing fine. Some days I even believed it. The first sign that something more specific was wrong. Not just the general wrongness of a life organized around other people's needs, but something particular and targeted, came in the autumn of 1998. Patty was 20, away at the University of Kentucky on a partial scholarship studying accounting. Dennis was 17 and a junior at the high school, consumed by his senior baseball season that was already being planned. Carolyn was 14, quiet and watchful as always. It was a Sunday in early October, one of those Kentucky autumn days when the sky turns a shade of blue that seems almost theatrical, too vivid to be real. I had made a full Sunday dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from the garden I had put up in jars back in August, biscuits from scratch. The house smelled warm and rich and good. I had also, that week, been dealing with a sinus infection that had kept me awake for 3 nights running, and I had a conference at Dennis's school the following Tuesday that I still needed to prepare for, and the Whitfields had asked if I could come in an extra morning that week to help with a backlog of alterations. Halfway through dinner, Gerald looked up from his plate and said, very casually, that he had told his sister, Darlene, and her husband that we would host Christmas that year. Darlene and her husband lived in Knoxville. They had 4 children. That would mean 11 people at my table for the holiday, plus the cooking, the cleaning, the guest bedding, the everything. He said it the way you might mention you had remembered to pick up milk. As information, not as a question. Not as something requiring my consent or my input or even my acknowledgement as a person with a schedule and a capacity and a finite number of hours in each day. I remember the feeling of the mashed potatoes in my mouth going from warm and comforting to something closer to cement. I remember the way the afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window at a low angle, the way it caught the steam rising from the green beans. I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, he didn't ask me. It didn't even occur to him to ask me. I said something agreeable. I don't remember exactly what, but it was agreeable. Something like, that'll be nice, or we'll need to get the guest room sorted. Something that closed the subject without opening the one I actually needed to have. Carolyn was looking at me. I felt her eyes on the side of my face. I didn't look back at her. That night, washing dishes while Gerald watched football in the other room, I let myself think for exactly 45 seconds about what it would have felt like to say. You should have asked me first. Just that. Just those 5 words. Then the timer I kept inside me, the one that had been calibrated since childhood to measure how much feeling was safe to express, went off, and I put the thought away, dried my hands, and went to check on Carolyn's homework. The second sign came in the spring of 2001. The children were mostly grown by then. Patty had graduated from UK and was working at an accounting firm in Lexington. Dennis was finishing his junior year at Morehead State, and Carolyn was 17 and already making plans to leave Middlesboro the moment she could. I had recently left the Whitfields' dry cleaning business. Mr. Whitfield had retired, and they'd sold the shop, and was working part-time at the public library. cataloging new acquisitions and helping with the children's reading program on Saturday mornings, which I loved with a passion that still surprises me when I think about it. That April, I turned 44 years old. Gerald did not forget my birthday. I want to be accurate about that. He bought me a card and a box of chocolates from Walgreens, and he said, "Happy birthday, Loretta," when I came downstairs that morning. What he did not do, what it apparently did not occur to him to do, was to arrange anything. No dinner reservation, no evening plan, no indication that the anniversary of my existence was an occasion that warranted any particular effort on his part. I made my own birthday dinner. I made pot roast, which I love, and a chocolate cake from scratch with cream cheese frosting, and I set the table nicely and lit the candles I kept in the sideboard for special occasions. Gerald ate heartily and said the pot roast was excellent and watched the baseball game afterward. The thing that pierced me most about that evening, the detail that I have carried with me ever since, that I still feel in my chest when I think about it, was not his lack of effort. It was mine. The fact that I had made my own birthday dinner and made it well, and set the table beautifully and lit the candles, because I had understood, without being told, that if I wanted the occasion to feel like something, I was going to have to manufacture that feeling myself. I had become so accustomed to providing everything for everyone that I had started providing it for myself too, standing in for the person who was supposed to do it for me. Carolyn helped me clean up afterward. She was quiet while we worked, which was not unusual for her. Then, as she was hanging the dish towel back on the oven handle, she said, without looking at me, "You deserve more than this, Mom." I told her that everything was fine and sent her upstairs to finish her homework. The third sign is harder to describe because it wasn't a single incident, but rather a pattern I began to notice with uncomfortable clarity in the years after the children left home. By 2003, all three of them were gone. Patty in Lexington, Dennis had moved to Cincinnati after graduating, and Carolyn had gone to Louisville to study nursing, which she had wanted to do since she was 12 years old, and had watched a nurse hold my mother's hand during a difficult hospitalization. The house on Cumberland Avenue was suddenly very quiet. I had expected that emptiness. What I had not expected was the way Gerald's needs expanded to fill it. With the children gone, the domestic machinery I had been running for 25 years didn't wind down. It simply redirected. Gerald retired from the dealership in 2007 at age 59, earlier than I had anticipated, and from that point forward he was home. All day, every day. Present in the way a large piece of furniture is present, occupying space, requiring accommodation, generating a kind of gravitational pull that reorganized the rest of the room around itself. He had opinions about the meals I made, not complaints, exactly, but preferences that needed to be consulted and accommodated. He had a schedule that needed to be worked around. He had laundry that needed doing, and errands that needed running, and a social life such as it was that involved the Tuesday morning coffee group at the church fellowship hall and the occasional fishing trip with his brother Warren. And he assumed, without ever stating the assumption, because assumptions you've held your entire life don't feel like assumptions. They feel like the natural order of things. That I would continue to organize the domestic world around his rhythms, the same way I always had, the same way I apparently would always have. I was 50 years old. I was still working at the library 3 mornings a week. I had taken up quilting, which I was discovering I had a talent for. An irony that was not lost on me, given that quilting was also what my mother had done when she needed something to do with her hands that was purely hers. I had a small circle of women friends from the library and from my church group, women my own age, who gathered occasionally for coffee or a potluck dinner, and with whom I laughed more freely and spoke more honestly than I ever did with my husband. And still, Thanksgiving was mine to plan and execute. Christmas was mine to plan and execute. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering that fell on the calendar, mine. Gerald's contribution was to show up at the table and eat. The fourth sign happened in November of 2009, and it is the one that I think of as the hairline fracture, the point at which something essential inside me began, very slowly, to crack. Patty had called in late October to say she was coming home for Thanksgiving and bringing her husband Marcus and their 2 children, 7-year-old Lily and 4-year-old James. Dennis was also coming from Cincinnati with his girlfriend, later his wife, a woman named Suzanne, who was perfectly pleasant but who had never, in 10 years of holiday visits, once offered to help in the kitchen. And Carolyn was driving up from Louisville alone, as she was between relationships that year. I had been planning the meal since the first week of October. I had the turkey ordered from the butcher on Maple Street. I had a list of 12 dishes, 12, that I had been refining and revising for a month. I had cleaned the house from top to bottom over the preceding 2 weekends. I had borrowed 2 extra folding chairs from the church. I had made 3 pies, pumpkin, pecan, and apple, from scratch the Wednesday before the holiday. Thanksgiving morning, I was up at 5:30 to get the turkey in the oven. Gerald was still asleep. He slept until 8:30, came downstairs in his robe, made himself a cup of coffee from the pot I had already prepared, sat down at the kitchen table with the newspaper and said, "What time's everyone getting here?" By 10 o'clock the kitchen was hot and loud and complicated. The turkey was roasting. 3 different dishes were in various stages of preparation. I was making cornbread dressing, my mother's recipe, the one with the sage and the celery and the day-old cornbread crumbled by hand, and simultaneously monitoring the sweet potato casserole and keeping an eye on the cranberry sauce, which needed to be stirred regularly or it would scorch on the bottom. Gerald remained at the kitchen table. He had finished the newspaper and was now doing the crossword. Occasionally, he would reach over and taste something from a spoon I'd left resting on the stove and say, in a satisfied way, the sound of a man who is thoroughly content with his situation. At some point, I think it was around 11, when Patty and Marcus arrived with the children, I felt my back seize up. I had a disc problem that had begun 2 years before, a consequence of years of lifting and bending and carrying, and sometimes it simply gave out with no warning. I straightened up from the oven and felt that familiar white-hot lock across my lower back. I kept cooking. I stood sideways at the counter to relieve the pressure. I set my jaw, and I kept cooking, because 20-some people were coming to dinner, and there was no one else who was going to do it. Marcus, who is a good man, I have always said so, noticed that I was moving strangely and asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. He offered to help. I said I had it under control. He went back to the living room. Gerald, who had been in the same room with me all morning, did not notice until Patty pointed it out to him at noon. He looked up from his newspaper and said, "Loretta, is your back acting up?" in a tone of mild concern. I said yes. He said, "You should sit down and rest for a bit." And then he went back to his newspaper. That evening, after everyone had gone home and the dishes were done, I had done them myself, as usual, though Carolyn had stayed and helped. I sat in the dark kitchen for a while, too tired to move. The turkey carcass was in a bag in the refrigerator for soup. The counters were clean, the table was clear, the house was quiet. I thought about the moment I had felt my back seize, and I thought about Gerald at the kitchen table doing his crossword, and I thought about 24 years of Thanksgivings stretching behind me like a long, exhausted road. And I thought about something my mother had said once, very near the end of her life. She died in 2005, quietly, in a hospital bed in Harlan, when I had been sitting with her and she had reached over and taken my hand with her papery, always moving hand that was finally still, and said, "Loretta, I should have stopped sooner." I hadn't known what she meant then. I understood exactly what she meant now. The 5th sign was smaller, almost embarrassingly small, and it happened on a Wednesday afternoon in March of 2015. I was 57 years old. Patty had 2 children now, Lily and James, who were 13 and 10 respectively. Dennis and Suzanne had gotten married and had a son, Trevor, who was 6. Carolyn had also married, a kind, quiet man named Dale Whitmore who worked in hospital administration in Louisville. And they had twin daughters, Emma and Claire, who had arrived in 2011 and were 3 years old in 2015. Which is to say, they were delightful and exhausting in the precise way that 3-year-olds always are. That Wednesday, I had driven an hour and a half to Lexington to watch Lily's school choir performance. Patty had asked me 3 weeks earlier, and I had rearranged my library schedule and driven through intermittent rain on the interstate because Lily had the voice of something miraculous, and watching her sing gave me a feeling I couldn't quite put into words. Something about hope and continuity and the future being better than the past. The concert was wonderful. Lily sang a solo. I cried quietly in my seat with my program in my lap, one of those good cries that cleans something out of you. Afterward, Patty took me to a restaurant in Lexington for a late lunch. We sat across from each other in a booth by the window, and she told me about her job, and about Marcus's new project at work, and about the children's school activities, and I listened and asked questions, and was genuinely interested, because I am always genuinely interested in my children's lives. That has never been the issue. Then I mentioned, almost in passing, that I had been thinking about taking a watercolor class at the Community Arts Center in Middlesboro. There was a teacher there, a woman who had exhibited at the gallery in Knoxville, and the class met on Tuesday mornings for 8 weeks, and it cost $45, and I had been looking at the description online for the better part of a month with a feeling I couldn't quite name, but that might have been longing. Patty looked at me across the table with an expression of genuine surprise, as if I had said something mildly unusual. "Watercolor?" she said. "Since when are you interested in painting?" I explained that I had always been drawn to visual art, that I had sketched a little when I was young, that the quilting I had done for years was, in its way, a visual art, composition, color, pattern, that this felt like a natural extension. Patty smiled and said, "Well, that's cute, Mom," and then moved on to talk about Marcus's vacation plan for the summer. Cute. Like a hobby I was proposing because I needed to be kept busy. Like a small, manageable, non-threatening thing that a woman my age might do to fill her hours. Not like a thing I wanted because I was a person with an interior life and the desire to expand it. I said nothing. I did not take the watercolor class. I cannot tell you exactly why. Some combination of inertia. Gerald's schedule requiring weekend meals at regular times, which somehow bled into Tuesday mornings, and the echo of Patty's word, cute, sitting in my chest like a small, hard stone. The 6th sign. And I say sign, because that's what I understand now, that these were all signs pointing toward the same destination. The one I would finally arrive at many years later came in the Thanksgiving of 2019. This one is the clearest, the sharpest, the one I can reconstruct with the most precision because it was the moment when the hairline fracture became something closer to a break. By 2019, the grandchildren were numerous and getting bigger. Lily was 23 and engaged to a young man from Lexington. James was 20. Trevor was 11. Emma and Claire were 8. And Gerald and I had been married 43 years, which is a number that, when you say it out loud, sounds either like an achievement or a life sentence, depending on which side of the table you're sitting on. Thanksgiving 2019 was the biggest gathering we'd ever had. 12 people at the table. I had started planning in early October, as always. I had made lists and revised lists and bought things and prepared things and cleaned things and arranged things. I had ordered a 24-pound turkey and brined it overnight in a 5-gallon bucket in the garage. Something I had seen demonstrated on a cooking program and had wanted to try for years. Patty, Dennis, Carolyn, and all their families arrived on the Wednesday evening before. The house was full in the way I had always, on some level, wanted it to be full, loud with children, smelling of the pumpkin pies I had made that afternoon. The table extended to its full length with both leaves in, candles on the sideboard, the good tablecloth from the cedar chest. Thanksgiving morning, I was up at 4:30. The turkey went in the oven at 5. By 7, the kitchen was warm and busy, and I was deep in the pleasure of it. That specific pleasure of orchestrating a large meal that feeds people you love. A pleasure I have always felt, and that I do not want to pretend I didn't feel. Because that would be a lie and a falsification of the complicated truth of my situation. At 9 in the morning, Dennis came downstairs, poured himself a cup of coffee, and said cheerfully, "Mom, you outdid yourself. It smells incredible in here." I thanked him. He took his coffee into the living room. By 10 o'clock, everyone was up and in motion. Children running through the house, adults drinking coffee and watching the Macy's parade on television. Marcus offered to take the children outside to run around for a while, bless him. Carolyn came into the kitchen, tied on an apron, and said, "Tell me what I can do." Carolyn has always been the one who came into the kitchen. I should say that clearly, because it matters. Suzanne, Dennis's wife, sat in the living room with her feet tucked under her on the armchair and watched the parade. Gerald sat at the kitchen table. He had done this every Thanksgiving for 43 years. He sat at the kitchen table and he chatted companionably while I worked, which he perhaps believed constituted a form of company and support. He told me about something he'd read in the paper. He told me about a conversation he'd had with Warren, his brother. He refilled his own coffee cup twice. At 11:15, the cornbread dressing was in the oven alongside the turkey. The sweet potato casserole was assembled. I was making gravy from the neck and giblets I had simmered since early morning, a process that requires attention and stirring, and a certain amount of finesse if you want it to be smooth. I was also, at that exact moment, developing what I later learned was a urinary tract infection. I had felt the first uncomfortable signals the evening before and had been hoping it would resolve itself, which it was not doing. I was standing at the stove, stirring gravy, with a UTI and a backache and 43 years of Thanksgivings behind me. And Gerald said, with great satisfaction, "You know, Loretta, every year I think it can't possibly be better than last year. And every year you prove me wrong." And I smiled. I smiled at him across that kitchen that I had never stopped tending for 43 years, and I said thank you. That night, when everyone was finally asleep and the kitchen was cleaned and I was lying in bed, waiting for the ibuprofen to work on the ache in my back and the burn of the infection I would go to the doctor for on Friday, I made a decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not yet. More of a quiet internal recalibration, the needle moving 1 degree. I thought, I cannot keep doing this forever. Not I won't. Not I refuse. Just I cannot. A recognition, finally, that I was a finite person with a finite body and a finite supply of the energy required to feed and serve and organize and maintain and please everyone around me. That I was 62 years old and I had spent 43 of those years in the service of other people's comfort, and not once had anyone sat across from me and said, "What do you need? What would you like? What would make this holiday meaningful for you?" I lay in the dark and I thought about that watercolor class I hadn't taken in 2015. I thought about Mrs. Albright and the sharp mind she had seen and what I had done with it. I thought about my mother and her always moving hands that had finally gone still, and what she had meant when she said she should have stopped sooner. And I thought, I am going to stop. Not everything. Not being a mother or a grandmother or a person who loves her family, but the performance of it. The invisible, unpaid, unacknowledged labor of being everyone's soft place to land while no one noticed I was falling. I was going to stop. I just needed to figure out exactly how. The years between 2019 and 2024 were years of slow, private preparation. I want to describe them accurately because this part of the story is often misunderstood when I tell it. People tend to assume there was a single dramatic breaking point, one final terrible event that pushed me over the edge, and the truth is both simpler and more complex than that. There was no single event. There was an accumulation, a geological layering of small moments and quiet recognitions that eventually reached a critical density. And there was, alongside that accumulation, something new, a growing sense of my own life as a thing I might still take hold of if I was willing to be honest about what holding it required. I had started, around the time of the 2019 Thanksgiving, attending a women's discussion group at the public library, a monthly evening gathering facilitated by a social worker named Beverly Harmon, who had moved to Middlesboro from Nashville 5 years earlier. The group had no formal agenda. It was simply women, mostly in their 50s and 60s, sitting in a circle in the library's meeting room with cups of tea or coffee, talking about their lives. About marriage and motherhood and work and aging and the strange experience of arriving at the second half of your life and realizing that the person you had become might not be the person you had intended to become. I had been going for 6 months before I said anything substantive in the group. I sat and listened, mostly, which is a skill I have spent my entire life developing. But then one evening in the spring of 2020, this was just before the pandemic changed everything, before we stopped meeting in person and shifted to phone calls and eventually video calls. A woman named Gloria, who was 65 and had been divorced for 15 years, said something that landed in me with the weight of a stone dropped in still water. She said, "I used to think that giving everything was the same as loving completely. And then I figured out that I had confused love with erasure. I had erased myself and called it devotion. Love with erasure. I had erased myself and called it devotion. I drove home from that meeting and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. Not crying exactly. Something more quiet than crying. A kind of recognition that was almost physical, like putting pressure on a bruise you had forgotten was there. I started, slowly, to think about what it would mean to stop erasing myself. Not in a grand way, not in a way that required announcing or confrontation. Just quietly, privately, to begin to think about what I actually wanted. Not as a wife, or a mother, or a grandmother. As Loretta. As the woman who had once stood in a school hallway with a grammar workbook pressed to her chest, feeling a flicker of possibility that she had allowed to be extinguished. What did Loretta want? I made a list, an actual handwritten list, in a spiral notebook I bought specifically for this purpose and kept in my purse so that it was never left somewhere Gerald might find it. Though in truth, Gerald had not been curious about the contents of my purse in 30 years. The list was not dramatic. It did not involve leaving or filing for divorce or doing anything sudden or irreversible. It was simply, things I want before I die. Loretta, age 62, the watercolor classes. I wrote them down first. Time in the mornings before anyone else is up, that is mine and only mine. To eat what I want for dinner without considering whether Gerald will like it. To go somewhere by myself, anywhere, just once, for more than a day. To stop planning Thanksgiving. That last one surprised me when I wrote it. I sat and looked at it for a long moment. That spiral notebook open on my lap in the parking lot of the Dollar General where I had gone to buy dish soap. To stop planning Thanksgiving. Not to stop loving my family. Not to stop being grateful for the abundance of people in my life. Just to stop being the engine of that particular ritual. To stop being the person who made it happen while everyone else simply showed up and enjoyed it. I thought about what it would look like if I simply didn't plan it one year. If I let the holiday arrive on the calendar like it always did, and did not begin in October, and did not make the lists, and did not order the turkey, and did not clean the house and brine the bird, and make 12 dishes from scratch, what would happen? The answer, I suspected, was that someone else would figure it out, or everyone would eat sandwiches, or the holiday would simply not be the elaborate production it had been for 40 years, and the world would keep rotating on its axis regardless. I took the watercolor class in January of 2021. I told Gerald I was going to a Tuesday morning group at the Arts Center, and he said, okay, and did not ask what kind of group. I went for 8 weeks and discovered that I had something, not genius, not technical mastery, but a genuine feel for color and composition, a way of seeing light on water and shadow on leaves that surprised my teacher, whose name was Hazel Morse, and who said to me after the 3rd class, "You have a real eye, Loretta. You've been holding this back from yourself for a long time, haven't you? I took 3 more classes over the following 2 years. I began to paint in the kitchen on Tuesday mornings, just for an hour or two, before my library shift or before Gerald was expecting lunch. Small watercolors of the backyard, of the dogwood tree in April, of the hills visible from the back window in October when the color was coming down. I didn't show them to anyone. I painted them and laid them on the table to dry and then put them in a folder in the closet of the spare bedroom, where they accumulated like evidence of something I was slowly reclaiming. The pandemic years were strange and difficult in ways I don't need to detail because everyone who lived through them carries their own version. What they meant for me specifically was that the grandchildren were home from school and the children were stressed and worried and leaning on me more than usual, calling daily, needing reassurance, needing the sound of my voice, telling them everything was going to be all right. I gave that freely and without resentment. What the pandemic also meant was that Thanksgiving 2020 was small, just Gerald and me, because it was not safe to gather. I cooked a small turkey and 2 side dishes and made 1 pie, and we ate quietly at the kitchen table, and it was the least exhausting Thanksgiving I had had since 1977. After dinner, Gerald said, "This is nice, simple." And I thought, yes it is. By 2022, I had arrived at a clarity that had been building for years. I was 65 years old. Gerald was 69 and in reasonable health. With the usual assortment of older man ailments, a knee that complained in cold weather, blood pressure that required 1 medication, a tendency to fall asleep in the recliner after dinner. He was not infirm. He was not dependent on me for his survival. He was simply accustomed to me. Patty was 44, a senior partner at her accounting firm. Dennis was 41, working in Cincinnati in logistics management. Carolyn was 38, a registered nurse with 15 years of hospital experience, married to Dale and raising their twin daughters. My children were adults, capable adults, with resources and partners and the ability to solve problems. They had been adults for a long time, and yet they had all, without exactly deciding to, maintained a relationship with me that was calibrated for a version of me that had existed 30 years earlier. The version who was available, who was the center of the domestic gravity, who could be called upon to provide meals and care and emotional support and holiday celebrations and grandchild watching and whatever else was required, on demand, without compensation and without ever expressing a need of her own. The realization that struck me in 2022, sitting on the back porch in June with a cup of coffee and one of my small watercolors drying on the porch railing, was not angry. It was simply accurate. My children had not grown up into people who saw me. They loved me. I was certain of that. But they loved the idea of me, the Loretta who was always there, always available, always making things right. The actual woman, the one who had wanted to go to college in 1975 and had not, the one who had a watercolor in the spare bedroom closet and a notebook full of things she wanted before she died. That woman was more or less invisible to them. And that, I understood, sitting on that porch with my coffee going cold, was at least partly my fault. I had made myself invisible by always being present in the same way, in the same role, year after year. I had never shown them any other version of me because I had, for so long, not known how. The autumn of 2023 was when the plan began to form with real specificity. I was 66 years old, and the thing I had been circling, the thing I had been moving slowly towards since that night in 2019 when I lay in bed with a UTI and a backache and felt the first clear, cold breath of my own truth, was finally close enough to touch. I had been talking to Beverly Harmon, the social worker from the women's group. Not in the group context, but individually. She had a private practice. And I had started seeing her once a month for what I supposed you might call counseling, though I had never in my life thought of myself as someone who needed counseling or even knew how to ask for it. She was a calm, sensible woman who did not flatter or coddle, who asked good questions and waited without impatience for answers, and who had helped me articulate, over the course of several conversations, what it was I actually wanted. What I actually wanted, Beverly helped me understand, was not revenge. It was not punishment. It was not even necessarily Gerald's transformation into a different kind of man, though if that had been available, I would have welcomed it gladly. What I wanted was to be seen, to have my family understand, really understand. In their bones, what I had been doing and what it had cost me and what it would mean if I stopped. And Beverly asked me, what if instead of trying to make them understand with words, you showed them? That was when the turkey and the keys entered the story. The plan that Beverly and I developed over the course of 6 months, from early spring to late summer of 2024, was not a spontaneous act of desperation. It was deliberate. It was considered. It was, in its way, the most carefully organized project I had undertaken since I organized the church's centennial celebration in 2003, which had required coordinating 40 volunteers and a budget of $12,000 and a 3-day event schedule, all of which I had done alone while also cooking the Friday night dinner for 200 people. The plan had several parts, and each part mattered. First, I made financial preparations. I had, for the past 6 years, been setting aside a small amount from my library pay into a separate account that Gerald did not know about. Not because I was hiding anything unethical. We had always kept somewhat separate finances, a holdover from my working years, but because I had sensed, somewhere in the back of my mind, that I might one day need resources of my own for a purpose I hadn't yet named. By the fall of 2024, I had a little over $14,000 in that account, held at a different bank from our joint account, with only my name on it. Second, I researched my options. Beverly had connected me with a woman from her professional network, a family counselor named Dr. Sandra Kimbrough, who specialized in what she called late-life transition, the experience of adults in their 60s and 70s reconsidering the structures they had built their lives around. I spoke with Dr. Kimbrough by telephone 4 times between April and October of 2024. She helped me understand that what I was planning was not abandonment. It was not cruelty. It was, in her words, a loving but firm refusal to continue a pattern that was harming you and, ultimately, harming your family too. I held on to that framing with both hands. Third, I found a place to go. My friend Ruth Ann Castleman. Ruth Ann had been my closest friend for nearly 20 years, a woman I had met at the library where she worked part-time in the circulation department, had a sister in Corbin, Kentucky, a woman named Myra, who had a small rental cottage on her property that she occasionally rented to travelers. Ruth Ann had spoken to Myra on my behalf, without many specifics, and Myra had agreed to let me have the cottage for 2 weeks at a price I could afford. The cottage was about 40 miles from Middlesboro, far enough to be away, close enough that I could return quickly if a genuine emergency arose. I had told Ruth Ann the general shape of what I was planning, not every detail, but enough. Ruth Ann is a woman who has seen enough of the world to not be easily shocked, and her reaction had been to reach across her kitchen table, take my hand and say, "Loretta, it's about time." I had to breathe through something fierce and burning in my chest when she said that. Those 4 words. It's about time. Fourth, I thought very carefully about what to leave and what to take. I was leaving my house temporarily. I was not leaving my marriage, not permanently, not yet. I was leaving the performance of a role I could no longer perform. I needed to be clear about what that meant in practical terms. What I would take, my overnight bag, my watercolor supplies, my notebook, my medications, my good walking shoes, my mother's quilt, a box of books I had been wanting to read for years, and my dignity. What I would leave, my keys. My keys were the symbol I had chosen deliberately and with care. In 48 years of marriage and motherhood, those keys had been the instrument of my availability. They had unlocked the door of the house I maintained, the car that carried me to the grocery store, the community center, the school events, the doctor's appointments. They were the literal and metaphorical keys to my service. Leaving them on the counter was the clearest statement I knew how to make. I am not unlocking anything for anyone today. What I would also leave, the turkey, raw in its roasting pan, exactly as I had placed it the night before. This was the sharpest irony, and I had thought about it carefully enough to know it was right. The raw turkey was not cruelty. It was clarity. 40 years of cooked Thanksgiving turkeys. 40 years of rising in the dark, and timing and basting and carving and serving and doing the dishes after. This year, the turkey would be raw. And the family who had gathered around that table for 40 years, consuming everything I provided without once asking if I needed help or rest or any consideration at all, would have to figure out what to do about it themselves. I had written a letter. I had written it and rewritten it 14 times over 4 months, sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning hours before Gerald was awake. The final version was 3 pages, handwritten on the good cream stationery I had bought for the purpose. It said everything I had not said in 40 years, not with anger, not with recrimination, but with the quiet, clear voice of a woman who has finally decided to be honest about what she needs and what she will no longer provide. The letter said, "I love you, all of you. I have loved you for 40 years with a completeness that I could not have done differently even if I had tried. But I have also, in the process of loving you, made myself invisible. I have made myself a function rather than a person. I have been the cook and the cleaner and the planner and the keeper of all the occasions, and I have done it without complaint and without asking for anything in return. And the result is that you have all, entirely without meaning to, forgotten that I am a person with needs and desires and a finite supply of energy and a life that is also worth considering. I am not going to try to explain 40 years in a letter. What I am going to say is this. I am 67 years old. I am in good health. I have been planning this holiday, as I have planned every holiday for 40 years, right up until this morning. The turkey is in the pan. The house is clean. The groceries are in the refrigerator. Everything you need is here, exactly where I always put it. But I won't be here to cook it. I'm going somewhere for a while. Somewhere quiet, where I can remember who I am when I'm not serving everyone else. I have Ruth Ann's number if there is a genuine emergency, and by genuine emergency I mean something that requires a hospital, not something that requires someone to find the can opener. The letter goes on, but the rest of it was for my family specifically, and some of it is theirs to keep. I placed the letter on the kitchen table. I put a smooth stone on top of it to keep it from shifting. A gray river stone from the creek behind my parents' house in Harlan that I had carried in my purse for years for reasons I had never entirely been able to explain. Then I picked up my car keys from the hook by the door, where they had hung for 40 years, and I set them on the counter by the fruit bowl with a gentleness and a deliberateness that felt, in that moment, like something sacred. I picked up my overnight bag. I opened the front door. The morning was cold and bright, that November cold that has a clarity to it, like a lens polishing the world to sharpness. The sky was pale blue at the horizon and deepening as it climbed. I stood on the porch for a moment, just a moment, and breathed the cold air in and felt it fill my lungs, clean and real. And then I walked to my car and I drove away. If you're feeling the weight of that moment the way I felt it, take a second right now and hit the like button. And leave me a comment telling me what you'd have done standing on that porch. Would you have walked out? I want to hear from you. I want to tell you exactly what happened in the hours after I drove away from that house, because I think what happened is important. And I think the way it unfolded tells you something true about the situation I had been living in for 40 years. I drove to Myra Castleman's cottage outside Corbin in about 50 minutes, with the radio turned up to a volume I never used when Gerald was in the car, and the heater blowing warm, and my hands very steady on the steering wheel. I was not shaking. I was not crying. I felt something I cannot entirely describe except to say that it was very quiet and very clear, like a room you walk into after a long time away and find that nothing has moved. Everything is where you left it. You are exactly where you were supposed to be. The cottage was small and clean and cold when I arrived. Myra had left the heat turned down to save energy. But within 20 minutes, I had the heat going, and my overnight bag unpacked, and the kettle on, and my mother's quilt spread over the armchair by the window, and I sat down in that armchair with a cup of tea and looked out at the November landscape. Brown fields, bare trees, the sky doing what Kentucky skies do in late November, going that particular shade of pewter that looks like the world is taking a breath. I sat there for a while. I didn't do anything. I sat and drank my tea and looked out the window and breathed. Just breathed. At approximately 11 o'clock, my phone began to ring. It was Patty. I let it go to voicemail. I sat with the knowledge of that, the knowledge of her voice being on the other end of the call, her concern or her frustration or both, and I held my cup of tea with both hands, and I breathed, and I let the phone ring, and I did not answer it. She called twice more, then Dennis called, then Carolyn called, and then called again, and her second call. I watched carefully because Carolyn, as a nurse, is the one in my family most likely to have an actual medical emergency on her hands, and I needed to be certain it wasn't that. But it wasn't. I let it go. Gerald called once, around noon, just once. That single call told me more about our marriage than perhaps anything else in the preceding 48 years. I called Ruth Ann at 12:30, not because anything was wrong, but because I needed to hear a voice that knew me. She answered on the second ring and said, "Are you there?" And I said, "I'm here." And she said, "Good," in a voice that meant it completely. And we talked for 45 minutes about nothing particular and everything important. Around 2 in the afternoon, I turned my phone to vibrate and set it on the nightstand and took out my watercolor supplies. There was a view from the cottage's small window that I had been looking at for 2 hours. A silver creek visible at the edge of the brown field, bare willows over it, the pewter sky above. I set up my small portable easel on the kitchen table, and I painted for 3 hours without stopping. I ate soup from a can for dinner. I read for an hour in the armchair under my mother's quilt. I went to sleep at 9 o'clock and slept without interruption until 6:30 the following morning, which was the longest unbroken sleep I had had in perhaps a decade. Back in Middlesboro, from what I was told later by Ruth Ann, and eventually by Carolyn, Thanksgiving Day 2024 unfolded something like this. Patty arrived at the house at noon with Marcus and the children to find Gerald standing in the kitchen looking at the raw turkey with an expression that Carolyn would later describe as genuinely lost. Dennis and Suzanne arrived shortly after. The letter was read. There was initial panic. Where was I? Was I safe? Was something wrong with me medically? Which was handled when Ruth Ann received a call from Patty and confirmed that I was safe, I was fine, I was somewhere intentional. Then there was anger. Patty, I'm told, was angry first, and most intensely. She felt, as she would tell me weeks later, that I had blindsided them, that I had been passive-aggressive about something I could have addressed directly. I have thought about this characterization at length, and my response to it is this. I had been addressing it directly for 40 years. I had addressed it by cooking 24-pound turkeys while my back seized up. I had addressed it by making birthday cakes for my own birthday. I had addressed it by never taking a holiday, never asking for help, never stopping, never stopping, never stopping. The turkey left raw in the roasting pan on Thanksgiving morning was, in fact, the most direct communication I had ever offered them. They simply had not expected directness from me, because directness from me had never been required. I had always resolved the problem before anyone noticed there was one. Dennis, from what I understand, was the one who went to the grocery store and bought a pre-cooked rotisserie chicken and some side dishes from the prepared foods section. They ate Thanksgiving dinner that year from plastic containers and foil takeout trays, gathered around the table I had set and cleaned and kept for 40 years. Carolyn, who is a practical woman in addition to being a perceptive one, reportedly said while opening a container of pre-made macaroni and cheese, "This is fine. We're all fine." Now let's talk about why Mom felt she had no other choice. I love Carolyn so much, it sometimes feels like an organ function. I stayed at the cottage for 11 days, not the full 2 weeks I had planned. I came home on the 12th day because I was ready to come home, and because ready to come home and resigned to come home are entirely different things, and for the first time in 40 years, I was experiencing the former rather than the latter. In those 11 days, I painted every morning. I walked for an hour every afternoon on the road that ran past the property, wearing my good walking shoes and breathing the cold air and noticing everything. The way frost held on the north side of fence posts, the specific quality of December light in Kentucky, the sound my own footsteps made on the gravel. I read 3 books. I talked to Ruth Ann every day, and to Beverly Harmon twice, and to Carolyn on the 5th day when she called me from her car. I could tell she had stepped outside specifically to call me privately, and said, very quietly, "Mom, I saw this coming for a long time. Are you okay?" I told her I was better than okay. I was, for the first time in longer than I could trace, awake. Carolyn and I talked for 2 hours that day. She told me things I had not known, that she had been worried about me for years, that she had mentioned it to Patty and Dennis and been told she was making something out of nothing, that she had been aware since she was 14 years old that something in our family's arrangement was not right. She told me that she had felt guilty for years for leaving, for going to Louisville, for building her own life, because somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew she was leaving me to carry everything alone. I told her that was not her fault, that it had never been her job to fix what was mine to fix, that I had made my choices, and some of them had been wrong, not because I was weak, but because I had been shaped by a world that told women that their own needs came last, and I had believed it for a very long time. I also told her to eat her vegetables and get enough sleep, because some habits of motherhood you keep. The conversation with Gerald happened on day 8. He drove to Corbin. I had given him the address through Ruth Ann, after he called Ruth Ann directly and asked her, with what Ruth Ann described as genuine humility, if she would tell me that he needed to speak with me, and that he wouldn't push if I wasn't ready. That quality of restraint surprised me. I had not seen it before, or perhaps had not been paying attention when it appeared. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, driving the truck he'd had for 6 years, parking it carefully in front of the cottage. I had seen him pull up from the window, and I had felt something complex move through me. Not warmth exactly, not anger exactly, but something more like the recognition of a very long and complicated shared history. We sat at the small kitchen table of the cottage, across from each other, with cups of coffee between us, and Gerald said things that I had waited 48 years to hear him say. He said he hadn't understood. He said that he had, in his own limited way, believed that what I did was simply what I wanted to do, that the cooking and the cleaning and the planning were satisfying to me and were therefore fine. He said he understood now that this was not an excuse. He said he had read the letter 6 times. He said he was sorry. I listened. I listened for a long time, the way I have always been good at listening. And then I said, "Gerald, I believe you, and I need you to understand that this conversation is not the end of something. It's the beginning of something different, if we can manage it. If you're willing to actually change, not just to apologize." He said he was willing. I told him I would come home in 3 days. And I told him that when I came home, things were going to be different, and I laid out, clearly, specifically, without anger, but also without room for negotiation, what different meant. It meant we would share the cooking and the cleaning. It meant holidays would be planned together, or I would not be planning them at all. It meant that if his family was coming to stay, that was a conversation we had together before any invitations were extended. It meant that when I said I was going to my watercolor class or my book group or anywhere else, no one asked what time I would be back or what was for dinner. It meant that my schedule, my energy, my body, and my time were treated as things that had value and limits, the same as his. He sat with that for a while. Then he said, "That's fair, Loretta." Not eagerly, not with excessive enthusiasm, just quietly, honestly, fair. 48 years of marriage, and it was the most real thing he had ever said to me. I came home on a Thursday. Not a Thanksgiving, just a regular Thursday in December, with bare trees and a cold sky and the smell of coming snow. The house was clean. Gerald had cleaned it, which was, I will be honest with you, somewhat imperfect in the execution, but entirely sincere in the intention, and sincerity is worth more at 67 than perfection. There was a bowl of soup on the stove. He had made soup. It was from a can that he had transferred to a pot and heated, and he had added crackers on the side and a glass of water, and it was the simplest meal imaginable, and it made me cry in a way that the 48 years of elaborate Thanksgiving dinners never had. The conversation with Patty was the hardest. She came to Middlesboro the Saturday after I returned, without Marcus and without the children. And she sat across from me in the living room with the expression she has always worn when she's trying to control something. Her jaw set, her hands in her lap, her voice very precise. She said she had been worried sick. She said what I had done had frightened the children. She said she wished I had come to her with my feelings rather than staging a scene. I let her finish. I let her say everything she needed to say, and then I said, very quietly, "Patty, I came to all of you with my feelings for 40 years. I came with my body, doing the work. I came with my presence, planning every occasion. I came with my time, which I gave completely and without reservation. That was me coming to you with my feelings. The problem was that none of you could see it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I hadn't expected. She said, "I didn't know you were drowning." And her voice, when she said it, sounded for just a moment like she was 17 again, the girl who had watched me with eyes that saw too much and said too little. I told her I hadn't known how to show her I was drowning, that I had learned, very young, that showing that kind of need was dangerous, that it meant something would go wrong, that the structure would fail, that I would fail. I told her that was mine to work through, and I was working through it. And I told her that going forward, I needed her to treat me as a full person, someone who had preferences and limits and a life, not as a resource to be drawn from. She went home that afternoon and called me the following day and said she had talked to Marcus and she wanted to do better. She said it simply, without fanfare. I told her that was enough, and I meant it. Dennis took it the most quietly of the three, which surprised me. He called me the week after I returned, and we talked for an hour, and he said mostly that he had not realized how much I carried, and that he was sorry, and that he was going to figure out how to be different. I believed him. Dennis has always been someone who acts on his intentions when he's certain of them. The uncertainty takes him longer than it does other people, but the follow-through, when it comes, is real. Carolyn called me every few days for the first month, not to check on me, but just to talk, to have the kind of conversation we'd never quite managed to have before, where I was a full person and she was a full person, and we were talking not as mother and daughter, but as two women who loved and respected each other. Those conversations have been one of the best things to come out of the whole experience. Gerald and I spent December negotiating in the most literal sense of the word. We sat at the kitchen table, that same kitchen table where he had sat doing crosswords for 43 years, and we talked about the household, about who would do what, about what the holidays would look like, about what I needed and what he was capable of and where those two things could meet. It was not smooth, it was not romantic or dramatic. It was two people in their late 60s learning to have an honest conversation about domestic labor and mutual consideration, which sounds both mundane and revolutionary, and it was both. Gerald began making breakfast. Not every day, not elaborately, but several mornings a week he got up and made eggs and toast and had them ready when I came downstairs. He has learned to run the dishwasher. He has learned that cleaning the kitchen does not just mean wiping the counter, but also includes the stove and the floor and the inside of the microwave. He has learned these things slowly and imperfectly, and sometimes with a helplessness that I find genuinely endearing because it is honest. He is not pretending to know what he doesn't know, and that, from Gerald, is something new and valuable. We did not do a big family Thanksgiving in 2024. That was the year I was at the cottage, the year of the raw turkey. We did December holidays differently. I sent a message to all 3 children in November saying that the family Christmas gathering would be at Patty's house in Lexington that year, and that I would be contributing 2 pies and my company, and would be grateful to be a guest rather than a host. There was some rearranging required. It worked out. Patty hosted Christmas 2024 with something that I can only describe as determined effort. It was not perfect, and she was tired afterward and told me so, which was the most honest thing she had said to me in years, and I received it as the gift it was. The spring of 2025 brought things I had not anticipated. I submitted 3 of my watercolors to the regional art show held in Harlan every May. Submitted them not with any expectation, but because Beverly had encouraged me to, and because I had decided at 67 to stop waiting to feel ready for things. One of the 3 placed in the community art category. It was a small blue ribbon, nothing dramatic, but they hung it on the wall in the gallery on Main Street in Harlan, next to the little card that said Loretta Hutchins, Middlesboro, KY, and I drove to Harlan with Ruth Ann and stood in front of it in the gallery and felt something move through me that I had been waiting for my entire life. I called Mrs. Patricia Albright. She was still alive, 82 years old and living in a retirement community in Harlan. And I told her. She remembered me. She said, "I knew you had it, Loretta. I always knew." I cried in Ruth Ann's car for 20 minutes afterward. Good tears, the kind that clean things out. My granddaughter Emma, one of Carolyn's twins, has started painting with me on Saturday mornings when she visits. She is 14 years old, and she is extraordinary, this child. She mixes color with an instinct that takes most people decades to develop. I teach her what I know, which is not a great deal, and she shows me the things she sees, which are remarkable. It is the most fulfilling thing I do with my time, these Saturday mornings, showing Emma that the world is full of color and that she has a right to capture it. The story of my Thanksgiving morning is something that other women have started asking me about. Word spreads in a small town and in a network of women who share things at library groups and church suppers and through the kind of quiet female solidarity that has always been the underground river of working-class communities. I have told it several times now, in different contexts, to different women. And what I notice every time is a particular expression that comes over their faces when I get to the part about the keys on the counter. A kind of held breath, a recognition, like hearing a word for something they have always felt but never had the language for. I tell them what I learned, not as advice. I have reached the age where I understand that unsolicited advice is rarely welcome, but as what happened to me, offered freely for whatever use it might be. If this story reached somewhere inside you, please hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss another story from this community. Leave a comment letting me know what you thought and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Every comment, every like, every subscription helps this channel reach another woman who might need to hear that she's not alone. Thank you, from the very bottom of my heart, for making it all the way here. What I learned at 67 is something I would give anything to have learned at 35. But I have also come to understand that some things cannot be learned early, because the living required to understand them simply takes the time it takes. You cannot rush the knowledge that arrives only through accumulation. You can only, when it finally arrives, receive it and act on it, and not waste what remains. Here is what I learned, as plainly as I can say it. Your needs are not a burden on the people who love you. They are information. They tell the people who love you who you are and what keeps you alive. And if you never provide that information, you are not protecting them. You are starving both yourself and the relationship of something essential. Service is not love. Service can be an expression of love, but it is not love itself. And when service becomes total, when it becomes the whole of what you offer and the whole of what is expected, it collapses the person offering it, which ultimately harms everyone. You cannot give from empty. You cannot love from a place of invisible resentment. You cannot sustain yourself on the gratitude that other people are not providing. It is never too late to put your keys on the counter and walk out into a cold November morning and breathe. The morning will still be there. The clear blue sky will still be there. And you, the woman who has been waiting patiently inside the function you were performing, she will still be there too, ready to be reclaimed. To every woman listening to this story who has made her own birthday cake, I see you. To every woman who has stood at a stove with a seized back, carving out the family's joy from her own exhausted body, I see you. To every woman who has written a list of things she wants before she dies and kept it hidden in her purse, I see you. You are not too old. You are not too small. You are not too anything. You are exactly where you are, and from where you are, you can still move forward. The kitchen will not fall apart without you. The turkey can be figured out. The holiday will survive your presence as a person rather than your performance as a function. What won't survive, what truly cannot last, is you if you don't stop. Stop. Take a breath. Leave the keys on the counter, just for a minute, and remember who you are when you're not unlocking things for everyone else. My name is Loretta Mae Hutchins. I am 67 years old. I spent 40 years being invisible in plain sight, and then one November morning, I walked out into the cold and I came back to myself, and it was the best thing I have ever done. It was not brave. Brave is for war heroes and first responders. What I did was simply necessary, and necessary, when you've denied it long enough, feels like courage. Go paint something. Take the class. Call the friend. Write the list. Say the thing you've been swallowing since 1985. You've been feeding everyone else for long enough. It is time, sweetheart, to feed yourself. God bless you for listening. Loretta out.